Welcome to another episode of Ex-Vicarious. I'm Braith, and today I'm joined by Michelle Akhidenor. She's not only part of Forbes 30 Under 30, but also B&T 30 Under 30, which recognizes trailblazers who dare to be different in the realm of media and advertising. The reason for this? Well, Michelle built a BIPOC and female-led podcast called Peers, which is sponsored by Shopify. She then launched her podcast agency, The Peers Project, where she creates podcasts for progressive Fortune 500 companies, including Alibaba, which has topped the iTunes charts. Now, Michelle has shifted her focus towards making podcasts for VC firms, which we'll get into today. Yo, by the way, if you're new here, let me quickly tell you why I even do this podcast. In one sentence, it's because I believe life is wasted if you're not doing everything you can to make your wildest dreams come true. This often means going against the crowd, taking unconventional career paths, and building the mindset that makes you a millionaire, Olympian, red carpet actor, or even the queen of a food empire. Those are the exact people I interview so that you can learn from them and turn your own wildest dreams into reality. If you're a regular listener of Ex-Vicarious, it'll help me a ton if you like, subscribe, or share this round. So thanks for being here. Let's get back to this week's guest. Michelle, how are you going today?
I'm well, Braith. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I just wanted to also check, was there anything I missed that you wanted to touch on before we get to the questions?
No, all sounds good to me, what you pulled together.
All right, perfect.
Awesome.
So I wanted to go back in time a little bit and start with the Monash Business and Commerce Student Society and how you grew that to being the second largest in the whole uni. So what did you take from that experience into your career?
BCSS is what we called it. It was the best time ever. Loved it. Loved university. We call it college out here in the US. But I mean, look, I think BCSS was really my first kind of foray into startup land or starting your own mini project, or I guess you could call a business. We really saw that society as a mini business of its own. And I was brought on as the director of marketing for, I think it was a period of 2 years. And this is a while ago now, I would say maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. So I'm just thinking back to that time. But look, I think for me, marketing has always been something that's come very naturally to me. I actually didn't even major in marketing. I majored in finance. I did a business commerce degree and also an arts degree as well. Podcasting, that's come naturally too. But no, marketing has always come very naturally to me. And so I think when I was part of that society at university, I really just did everything I could to grow the society. I would run events. I would speak to as many people as I could. I'm quite a social person. So for me, this idea of like, how could we grow this? Who else do I know? Who else do I have to be connected to? Always came very naturally. And I think that plus I had a great team around me, the president there at the time, it's so funny to think back. We all took it very seriously. Him and I would always band together and think, okay, how can we grow this to be the best and biggest club at college or at uni? And so, look, I would say there wasn't I can't think of like a method that I really took on to grow it, but I definitely remember feeling really passionate about it and passionate about growing this community and really making it the best it could be.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned how marketing has always come really easily or naturally to you. Was this the experience that made you realize that? Or was there something in the past where you kind of felt, okay, marketing is something that I really resonate with?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think prior to this experience, it was obviously high school, and those days I would do everything. My high school days, I was on the athletics track. I was also playing violin in the orchestra. I was at art school. I was doing everything. So I think for me, it was more so, just try as much as you can, even if you're not that great at it. And then I think through that, just trying so many different activities. And in high school, I did like languages, but I also did science. And I wasn't great at science, but I was great at languages. So I think you just learn what you're good at when you can just try a whole bunch of different things. And that's really how I did it back in the day and how I still do it today. And I think, when I think about college and uni, sure, that was probably one of the first experiences where I was like, oh, this is something I'm pretty good at. And I kind of like marketing and I kind of like bringing people together and building community and that kind of thing. And so I guess you could say, I mean, maybe there was an earlier time, but sure, let's go with that.
Yeah. You mentioned languages, and I noticed that, you can speak a couple languages. And I wanted to ask, where did your passion for language learning start?
Yeah, so languages are, even to this day, my absolute passion. I love learning foreign languages. I love being able to go to different countries and travel and speak. And I think at the end of the day, languages are just another form of comms, right? Communications. It's similar to marketing. It's similar to that, like comms. It's in that comms space. And so I think for me, the passion has always stemmed from I've just loved understanding how different cultures operate. You know, obviously I'm biracial, or not obviously, but I am biracial. I'm half Nigerian and I'm also half Greek. I was born and raised in Melbourne, Australia. And so I think for me, growing up with all these different cultures around me, being biracial, being, growing up in Oz, where you've got a mix of all sorts, that had always I don't know, it always just felt very natural and just very like I was very intrigued by it all. And so I think when it came to, when I got to prep or when I got to school, I was always like, oh, this is so interesting. And funnily enough, we got taught French as one of the early languages, when I was 5 years old. And I loved it. And I just thought it was really cool. And so I kept it going. And then when I got to year 7, Chinese was introduced at the school and I just loved languages. So I was like, oh, I'll do that too. And long story short, I ended up doing both of those languages all the way through to university. I did diploma in Mandarin and I did French major in my arts degree. So, I think for me, it's always stemmed from the curiosity that comes with understanding how other people live and different cultures operate and work. And naturally, to be able to really get that culture, you kind of have to know how to speak the language.
Yeah, and I wanted to delve into that a little bit more. Obviously, through the traveling and your exchange programs as well, how would you compare knowing someone else's language versus knowing the more subtle cultural differences and, cultural behaviors? How would you compare those two when you're trying to immerse yourself into a culture and really, get to know the people there?
I mean, I think it's a huge difference, right? You go to Italy, if you know Italian, you're going to have such a different experience than, myself, if I went to Italy, I don't know Italian. Not that it's a bad experience, it's just very different. And so I think for me, those early years of being so fortunate enough to do an exchange in China at 16 and then go to France at 17, I think those early days, I always say they shaped me. The reason I believe that I got into business, because I think when you go to a different country and you're trying to still learn the language and really understand how this culture works, that is, I think, one of the toughest or the best training grounds for when it comes to starting a business. So people
Right.
always ask me, well, you did a business degree, so that's why you started the business. And I'm like, well, funnily enough, the biggest training ground was when I was sitting, I did another exchange to Shanghai a bit later on, when I was sitting like at school in Shanghai trying to understand what the hell was going on because all my classes were in Mandarin. And that was just, and then you walk on the street and then no one speaks English, and I think that was just such an extraordinary experience that really prepared me, I guess, as best you can be prepared for the journey of entrepreneurship, where you're diving in to almost like an unknown territory. You feel like you don't speak the same language to anyone because you don't know what's going on. You're kind of making it up half the time. And you're really just trying to find a way to navigate through and not get discouraged by the fact that, you've been working at this for so long, but yet you still can't understand what the taxi driver's telling you.
Yeah. Were there any things that you did routinely or habitually to help you navigate all that uncertainty when you were trying to learn, new languages and new cultures that you've been able to bring into business?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a direct correlation. As I said, I think honestly, just persisting when you don't know what's going on. So I gave the example of, getting into a taxi in Shanghai and no, none of the taxi drivers, actually majority of the people don't know English. So, just trying to navigate and giving it a go and just persisting, even when you're like, oh, I don't really know if I'm making any sense to you. And I hope I'm going to the right destination. That's so, for me, that's like exactly what I do day to day, navigating, building my business. I'm currently out here in a new market. I'm currently in New York, and I've been here for 12 months to launch my business here. And so, it's a similar thing. It's you just persist and you try different avenues. And when you get it wrong, you kind of like, oh, well, if you end up at the wrong destination, you're like, well, I'll just try another route, So I think it's just learning languages has made me persist and just not get too discouraged when things get really tough, because that's just the journey of learning a language, and that's just the journey of starting a business.
Yeah. All right. Also, on the topic of persisting when you're taking all these different avenues, I did notice that before starting your own podcast, you had quite a diverse career, including sales, real estate, finance at an insurance firm. And I wanted to ask, was this strategic or more just an exploration of, shifting interest over time?
I love how you say that so lovely, Braith. You're like, you're a diverse career across 1,000,001 different industries. Was that intentional? Look, I wish I was that strategic and I knew what I was doing at like 20, but no, not at all. I think I will say I actually, is something that people may not know, is that I actually started my podcast or this entrepreneurial journey in my final year of studies. So all of my experience prior to walking out of college and starting my business was just for me to understand what I wanted to do. As I mentioned, I was in love with languages, but I also had this finance degree that I was doing, and I was at the marketing society. And for me, that idea of just trying different paths and different things, as I've done in pretty much my whole life, came through in my career. So I remember thinking, great, I'm going to go get an internship at an accounting firm. And then I'm going to try and do like a part-time job, which almost was like full-time pretty much while I was studying at an insurance company, an insurance brokerage firm. And then at the same time, because my family's in property and real estate, I was like, maybe I'll do a stint at CBRE because, I can, and I'll do that on the side of my like third semester or whatever I'm doing. So I think for me, it was never a case of like, oh, I know exactly what I wanted to do. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I had no idea what I wanted to do post studies. I think that can be a really scary space to be in when you're so used to knowing what comes next. You finish high school, you get into a good university, and then it's like, okay, great, you study really hard. And then the idea is that you go off and get a good job. But what industry is that job in? What does that job look like? How do you even know if you're going to like it? And so for me, it was always, how can I try and test as many different jobs and industries that I possibly can so that I can make the most informed decision for myself?
Yeah. No, I love that. You mentioned also that, starting the podcast in your final year of uni, right? So what compelled you to start Peers?
So the year was 2017. And I was 23 years old, and I was about to head off to do my final semester in the UK. And I remember feeling really worried about what I was going to do after college, after university. As I mentioned, I'd done a bunch of different internships and jobs and pretty much full-time jobs and part-time jobs in all these different industries. And I had a lot of my friends at the time going off and getting, really beautiful corporate jobs like the Big Four and all these big accounting firms. And that was absolutely the trajectory I thought I was going to be on. But I remember at the start of that year when I was applying for all these graduate positions, I remember just thinking, I just wish I knew what it was going to be like when I was there, when I was sitting at the job post-graduation.
Mm.
And I just thought, you know what? I've kind of done corporate. Like I've really done it for the last 2-3 years. Like I don't really think this is for me at all. But like, what else am I gonna do after 5.5 years of studies and my whole life studying and trying to overperform and whatever?
Mm.
And that's when I came up with this idea of, you know what? I'm just going to try and chat to people who I find really inspiring and who are on a different path. And at that time, I remember I was after my jobs during the day and like applying for other jobs. I would like jump online and I remember and I would like search and Google like entrepreneur and like these words I didn't even know how to say, like business owner, young. And I remember the Forbes under 30 list popped up. And this was such a pivotal moment for me where I clicked onto this list and I remember it was like 9 p.m. and it was like really dark in my bedroom and I just had like my little lamp on and I was like, I found this list. I was like, what is this about? And I started scrolling through and I started reading about the stories of all of these incredible young people who were like kind of my age, really my peers, who were out there creating these epic businesses, building these cool things, and being featured for all the awesome work that they were doing. And I just remember thinking to myself, I have to meet these people. And
Mm.
that's really where the idea for the podcast came about. I really was just like, oh my goodness, I need to meet these people. And what ended up happening was a lot of these people were based in New York because the list I'd found was Forbes under 30. It didn't exist in Australia at the time.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, I've got to go to New York. Like this has to happen. I've got to do this. And then I thought, you know what? Right before I go to London, I wonder if I have enough savings to make a quick trip to New York City. And I'd never been before in my life. I'd never been to the US. And long story short, that's when I started reaching out to these young entrepreneurs just via LinkedIn DM, being like, hi, I'm like a college student in Australia and I'm actually starting this like podcast thing. And funnily enough, at the time in 2017, although podcasting is like the word of the moment right now, podcasting was not a thing. Definitely not in Australia. People didn't even know what it was. The only reason I knew what a podcast was is because my sisters and I were obsessed with some of the podcasts coming out of the US. And we were
Mm.
one of the random people that are like, oh, you listen to how do you even listen to that thing? And so this was
Yeah.
before, just to put in context for the Aussie market, like the Shameless Girls who came up in 2018. Like this was before like the biggest podcasters, the She's on the Money who came up again. I think it was in 2018. Like this was way
Mm.
before a lot of the main podcasters in the Aussie market came up. So again, this was 2017 where it was still quite unknown. But naturally, podcasting in the US was booming. And so at the time, I remember chatting to a girlfriend being like, I just want to meet these amazing like, Forbes under 30 in New York City and I'm going to book this trip. And she was like, hang on a second. I want to hear what they have to say. I don't like my corporate job either. Like, I want to know. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe I should just record these conversations. And I initially thought, should I do a YouTube channel or should I do this podcast thing? And I thought, you know what? It's so much easier to have a microphone, be at a coffee shop and record these interviews versus having a full-blown video setup. So
Mm.
that's where the idea for Pierce came about.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I mean, a couple cool points is, it started with you finding this Forbes 30 under 30 list, which now you're in. So I think it's such a cool full circle moment there, which we'll get into later. And the other thing you mentioned about how, yeah, like back in those days, 2017, people didn't know about podcasts. And even a couple years ago when I first started getting into it, I think because Australia is still a little bit behind. Like I remember when I first started listening it like on the train, for example, and then if they said something funny, I would just like start laughing and then people look at me crazily. Like, but I do think like year by year, the adoption rate of podcasts and just the understanding of, like people do listen to podcasts quite often now has increased. So it's cool to see.
Hugely.
Yeah, I wanted to ask which episode was your favorite within 6 years of running, Piers?
Oh, that's such a tough one. Honestly, I'd just say the most memorable couple of episodes, because it's so
Yeah,
hard to pick one,
yeah.
was when we celebrated our the 5th year anniversary of my company, the Pierce Project, which I started after I started this podcast, but I kept running it. in 2022 in London. And we actually ran a live podcast tour in partnership with Shopify, who was our brand sponsor at the time. And I got to interview the most extraordinary, like about 5 UK entrepreneurs, one of which I'll call her out is Steph. She's the founder of Fuck Being Humble. And she's actually right in this day, like to this day, she's actually a really close friend of mine now, which is beautiful because we literally met on this podcast when I interviewed her in London. And now that I'm living in New York, she comes out here all the time. So her and I have seen each other so much in the last 12 months. But I think that time, that show, that tour was so, it meant so much to me because we were able to hire out this extraordinary space at the London edition, and we were able to make our own podcast studio, or like I got to pretty much create my podcast studio of my dreams from scratch for this tour. And just to give you like a visual like image of it, it was almost like in an underground bar, which was really dimly lit with these like really stunning leather couches. And, you know, essentially we turned that bar, and it was really small. It was in like the hotel's basement area into a podcast studio. So you can imagine like,
Right.
leather couches, like dimly lit lighting. And then we had like the full production crew come in and like essentially turn it into a studio. So it was just the coolest production I have ever run. And I've run so many as part of the business, different
Yeah.
parts of the world, but this one in London was extraordinary. And so those episodes are so special to me. As I said, there was 5 BIPOC female founders that I got to interview, and it was just a dream.
Yeah, no, that does sound really awesome. Just comparing live interviews to recorded ones, what would you say is the main difference?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, they're so similar, to be honest with you. I think the main difference is that as a host, you can't just be like, oh, hey, by the way, we can cut that out, or like, do you want to say this, or interrupt like the
Yeah.
conversation, which sometimes I've done, and I'm sure you do too. Whereas this is like, it's live, so you the flow of the conversation, it just has to kind of be there from the get-go. But I think, at that stage, it was like, I think it was like 250 episodes in. So I had a lot of practice, but I kind of knew I think I knew what I was doing. So by that stage, it just felt very natural. And I think the setting was just so beautiful, and the guests were amazing, that it just felt very organic, which I'm really
Mm.
grateful for, because otherwise live productions can be a bit of a mess if that's not the case.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned before how, after reading through that Forbes 30 under 30 list, seeing all these young entrepreneurs happen to be in New York, the thought of going to New York came pretty quickly, and obviously you executed on that pretty quickly as well. Have you always been like that? So have that sort of bias to action where you're like, okay, this is a big thing. It's quite major. Obviously, you haven't been to New York before. Podcasts aren't even that well known in Australia, but you just did it. So has that always been ingrained in you, that sort of bias to action?
Yes. I think, well, I know my mum drilled this into me very early on. So my sisters and I are almost so similar in this way, where I've got 2 sisters, but I'm the middle child, where mum always used to tell us, you can do anything, but if you want to do it, you actually have to go out and do it, right? So she was our biggest cheerleader. Both my parents are amazing. They're both my biggest cheerleaders, but my mum would be at like every piano lesson, every violin lesson, every sporting event I was in. And she would always say, you can do it. You can literally do anything, but just make sure you make it happen. And I think the
Mm,
make it happen part always stuck with me, where it was like, it's up to me. It's not anyone else's responsibility to progress my career, or to do what I actually want to do, or to pursue something different. And I think, unfortunately, in this day and age, I've also been a corporate culprit of it, where it's like, oh, well, that may be someone else's responsibility, or like, oh, oh, this happened, so how could it be my responsibility? Or like, I was at the peril of XYZ, and then it just didn't. And for me, it's always been like that no excuse, kind of just like no BS mindset that my mum kind of drilled
mm,
into me, where it's like, well, you can do it, but if you want to do it, you have to make it happen. And so there's definitely that, coupled with, I'm a recovering perfectionist, which, again, I speak a lot about this to my therapist. So I'm getting better. But that thing of, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it really well.
mm.
is something that's always stuck by me as well. And again, I think it's just, coming from an immigrant background where my parents worked their asses off to like give us all the opportunities that we have. And, if it was like, it was always just like, if you're going to do something, like do it to the best of your ability. And so for me, with this podcast, I was like, well, I'm already going overseas. It sounds extreme, but like I'm already headed overseas to the UK. We live on an island, when I was living in Australia, we live on an island in the middle of nowhere. If I am going to leave this continent, like I might as well stop on the way elsewhere. And so it just was kind of if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this properly, and I'm going to go as big as I possibly can with my miniature budget, actually my non-existent budget at the time, and just like my will to want to meet people. And so I think that, coupled with the responsibility that it's on me to get to where I want to be in life, to do what I want to do, to meet the people I want to meet, is the reason that the reason why I took it that far.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned being a recovering perfectionist. So I just wanted to ask, what exactly does that mean, and in what ways has it, I guess, helped you or hindered you in the past?
It's so funny, right? They always say your best quality or something is also your worst quality. And that is like absolutely true for me. I think, as I mentioned, I grew up in an immigrant household where my parents worked so hard to give us every opportunity that they possibly could. They're both entrepreneurs. My parents have run a company together for the last 40 years, and they always just drilled into us that like, you've got to hustle to make stuff happen for yourself. We're in an extraordinary country that has all these opportunities. You guys are attending the best schools. Like, you should make it happen for yourself. And so I think with that mindset, it's the reason why I've been able to achieve how much I've been able to achieve. But at the same time, it's also the reason that I've, had anxiety for years, that I have been so stressed out of my mind in so many times in my life that I've gotten myself so sick. And it is something that now at 30, I look back and I'm really grateful for what it's given me. But I'm also really mindful that as I progress on in my life and as I head into my 30s, like, it's not the way I want to operate. And I want to be kinder to myself, and I want to, feel like I'm enough. And I want to not always have to be the most perfect person in the room. And the reality is I'm not, and I wasn't. But I think that pressure to be the best, to be perfect, it's just not healthy long term. And I think for me, it is something to this day I'm still grappling with. I'm still working through it. I'm still, I catch myself at times where I go, oh my goodness, Michelle, it doesn't matter if that specific project isn't 150. Like, the team's done the best that they can do. You've done the best that you can do. Like, it's good enough. When sometimes good enough is enough, and it's something that I'm still learning.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. A lot of points you mentioned there, very relatable as well. And I feel like also with a lot of guests that I have on this podcast, a point that seems to come up is, balancing ambition and perfectionism with wanting to be a bit kinder to ourselves in the moment, and appreciate what we do have. And I think it's probably quite a common struggle amongst any entrepreneur. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to take a bit of a right turn. So I noticed that you were Shopify sponsored, which is awesome. But how long did it take for you to get your first sponsor? And what was the process like?
Forever. It took forever. It took about 4 years. So to give context, I started the podcast in 2017, in October. Actually, it's coming up on 6 years,
Yeah,
7
congrats.
years. Thanks. 2017, and then we got it. We signed the deal with Shopify 2021. So what's that, right? I don't know, like it feels like so much, 5 years or something, crazy. Exactly. So I started it late 2017. It was early 2021. So,
Right.
whatever that is, like 4 and a bit, 4 or 5 years. It was really tough. And again, I say this with so much love. My business journey has been as much as it may look shiny and pretty and buttoned up with a bow, like it is really tough. Even now, 7 years in, I'm still hustling. I'm still trying to like, figure out our customer acquisition strategy in this new market. I'm still trying to like hire the right people to be able to execute. Like it's starting a business or starting any initiative, a podcast, a business is just really hard to monetize, to be able to get to a stage where you can live it off your creation, to get to a stage where you feel like you can kind of breathe. And for me, I'm always really open about it. The first 4 years of starting my company, so I started my business in 2018, were very tough. I was living at home at my parents' house in Melbourne. All my friends had their beautiful graduate roles and their corporate jobs and were able to do things. And every dollar I made, I just put straight back into the business. And I was hardly making any dollars. And that's just the reality. I was working part-time. I was like at Deakin in the entrepreneurship faculty. Like I did that for a little bit just to like, try and survive. And gratefully, I have beautiful parents that allowed me to like stay with them. But I'm always really open about those first 4 years in business or when you start anything are really tough, because for me, I didn't have any prior experience. I was 23 when I started the podcast, 24, when I started my business, and I was just wading through the dark. I had no real experience. I didn't know what I was doing. I was really young. I was walking into meetings with people who were 30 years older than me, trying to pitch them this idea of this new medium that no one even knows what the hell it is, and go, hey, you got to do it because it's the future.
Yeah.
The medium was at a stage when I started where no one really knew what was going on. No one really knew how to have what a podcast was. So I would get into these meetings with these CMOs and they were like, I'm sorry, how do you listen? That coupled with the fact that I was young, BIPOC, female, and also the fact that I had no real experience in business. So it was just a culmination for me. I'm sure other people's experiences aren't as wild. But yes, that's all to say that it took that long to get it. Once I got it and once things started to flow, it's like it didn't stop, right? So that is the beauty of business and of being persistent. So Shopify, that deal was absolutely momentous. Like it was a major moment for me. As you can imagine, I've been doing this podcast on the side of my actual business, which is my podcast agency, the Peers Project, for so long. And I just kept persisting. I had pitched it so many times. Like I probably 20 pitch meetings, 30 pitch, like I'd pitched it so many times over all those years. And it was just like, no. Rejection, something I got, you get really good at as an entrepreneur. It's still my day to day. It's still like, no, we don't want you. I'm like, great.
Yeah.
And so when that came through, I distinctly remember the moment. So I had connected with the head of marketing at the time of APAC Shopify on LinkedIn. And I remember sending him off a DM. Again, I used to connect with so many people. Some of my major deals have been from literally a LinkedIn DM to the marketing lead. And at this time, I remember I sent the first DM in let's just say it's I don't know, August of 2020. And then I remember I didn't get a meeting with him until February of 2021. So you can imagine the amount of emails that I sent off. It was like every 2 months I check in, hey, I know you haven't responded to my last 5 emails, but I know you said on the, he gave me his email. He said he was interested on the LinkedIn. So I was like, great, I'm going to keep asking until you say no to me. And what happened was I remember we finally had the meeting early 2021 in February, and he felt the CMO at the time, Robin Martin, he's amazing. He's moved on now. But at the time he was like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry it's taken me so long to get back to you. I've just been so busy. Let's have a meeting. I pitched him the podcast. I pitched him my packages for sponsorship. And the way I'd structured those deals is that it was a 12-month partnership to work with us. And he was like, look, I'm actually really, really interested and keen in this. We don't do enough, I guess, BIPOC. We don't invest enough in, I guess, the BIPOC space. And so I'm really, really interested in this, but let me get back to you. And I was like, oh goodness, here we go again. It's going to be another 10 months. But luckily for me, I remember I was sitting at a dinner in Richmond in Melbourne with a girlfriend, and I got the email from him that said, yes, we'd like to go ahead with XYZ package. We're so excited to partner with you. Please feel free to send through the contract. And I just remember in that moment, I dropped my glass. I was shook. And I was like, oh, my girlfriend was like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Did someone die? And I was like, you will never believe what just happened. The CMO of Shopify just got back to me and told me he wants to sponsor the podcast. And she was like, oh my God. And we started screaming. And I'm in this restaurant and everyone's looking at me being like, oh my God, this girl's going to calm the hell down. But I was like, honey, you don't even know how much this has taken. So it was an absolute moment I will never forget. And no matter how many more deals you sign after like that first major deal, like the first one's always the best feeling. We ended up working with Shopify for a period of 24 months. They were absolute champions. Shout out to the guys at Shopify. I love you guys so much. And it was a dream. It was amazing.
Oh, what a story. What a story. I wanted to circle back to, you mentioned how Shopify knew they hadn't worked with many BIPOC podcasts or audiences in general. And obviously, being a BIPOC female-led business, that would have been one of the main things that mattered to you from the beginning, giving a voice to other voices which may not be heard as loudly and, promoting, both BIPOC and female voices. So I wanted to ask, was that from the very beginning when you first started a podcast, that was already something that you knew had to be at the forefront of the podcast, or like, how did that come about?
100%. I've known that I've wanted to do something in media for female, for BIPOC, or I didn't understand it at the time. Like I couldn't articulate it, but like since I was very, very young, I remember watching the television and my parents used to have like SBS on every night when we'd come home from school. And I remember just watching and I remember seeing Leland Ching. And I will never forget this woman. And she was like she was an Asian Australian that like I'd ever seen, like first like woman of color I'd ever seen on like national television. And I'm sure there were others that came aboard, but in my like 7-year-old brain, I remember being like, oh my goodness, wow, that's like the first BIPOC woman I've ever seen on TV. And again, I didn't know what that meant at the time. I remember clocking that so distinctly and being like, you know what? That's got to change. It's like I didn't know if I was the one to change it, but I just remember clocking that. I remember how seeing her made me feel. And even though I'm not, I'm biracial, even though I'm not like Asian Australian, I am a woman of color. And so seeing that representation at such a young age, I just remember feeling like, I love this woman. She's so cool. Like, I want to be like her. I didn't understand what that meant. And so it's funny how years later, like when I'm in my 20s, at the time, it just came so naturally for me. Like it was almost like ingrained. People often say like, did you think that you wanted it to be? I was like, that's just how it should be. Like it's so strange in my head. It is almost like, of course, like I've seen this from when I was so young. Representation matters. And if you don't see it, you can't become it. And I wouldn't say, Leland Ching is the reason I'm in media today. But at the same time, I just remember clocking that at whatever age I was, 7 years old or whatever, and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to be like that woman. And oh my gosh, why is this maybe the first time I'm seeing someone like her on TV?
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Were there any times before the podcast that you tried to start like BIPOC related initiatives or anything else that you may have tried to do or started before the podcast?
I don't think it was so much before the podcast. I think it was after. So I think what people may not know, and of course, if you don't know me at all, hello, I'm Michelle. You don't know my story. I hope you're enjoying this podcast. But after I started my podcast, The Peers, I came home from doing it in New York, and then I was in the UK to study, and then I came home after that, and I made I call it these days executive decision, because when you're a CEO who doesn't have a co-founder, you speak to yourself. So I said, like, I'm making an exec decision. So I made the executive decision, which is really just a commitment to myself, that I wasn't going to go out and get a corporate job, and that instead, because I was so inspired by all of these Forbes over 30 that I had interviewed around the world, I was going to try and start a business. At the time, I didn't know what that business was going to be. So I was like, as I said, podcasting was only up and coming. I never thought I could start a real business as a podcast agent. I mean, that was non-existent, like I didn't even know what that was. So I knew what a podcast was, but I never thought I could like start an actual business. So I went through a period of about 18 months of trying all these different businesses and failing miserably. Like I started like a social media marketing agency and that failed. I did like a coaching business and that failed. And then I did I remember I tried to get sponsorship. I was like, maybe it's just like the podcast is the actual business and like that's it. And then that I couldn't do that until years later, until we ended up getting Shopify years later. And so I felt so deflated. I felt so confused. And naturally, through everything I do, the idea of like BIPOC female just comes through because that's who I am. And I always love that idea of representation. So in any venture I founded, that was always like at the core in terms of my mission. But it wasn't sticking. Nothing was working. And that's when I decided I just remember I was in a pitch meeting with the CMO of a big university back in Australia. And I was pitching them sponsorship of my podcast. And I was like so happy to get this meeting with the CMO. And I was, again, I was just trying different avenues to start a business. Like, how do you actually make money creatively? And I was pitching them my podcast. And I remember him so distinctly saying, like, Michelle, like, it sounds really good. Like, I see what you've done in New York and London and whatever, and that's great. But like, I think we want to start a podcast for our brand, like a university-led podcast. Is that something that you do? And in that moment, I was like, absolutely, that's what I do. No, I just didn't mention that, but I can do that for you. Don't you worry, I can do that. And when I left that meeting, I was like, boom, I know what my business is going to be. I'm going to help brands start their own podcast. And again, I didn't even understand what production agency, podcast, like I was just like, that's with the service I'm going to offer to brands. And that's when I came up with this idea of, okay, when I did some research, okay, we're a podcast production house. Got it. We work with brands to help build their podcasts. And then in the summer of 2019, the US summer, so the Aussie winter of 2019 is when we ended up launching the agency. And that's when it all started.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. And especially to hear how, there were other things you tried before hitting the nail on this idea that came up in the meeting. Looking back now, when you compare, so when you're in the state of, okay, I want to start a business, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm going to try different things. Is there anything that makes it clear why certain things would work and why certain things won't work to you now, just in hindsight?
Yes. Thankfully, 7 years in, I finally get it. Oh my goodness. I think I'll use the example of our entry into the US market because it's exactly what I'm navigating through right now. So
Yeah.
I think when I started my business early doors, it was very much so passion-led, and I loved this medium of podcasting. And then, I was in this meeting and I was like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. So I was listening to the market at that time when I listened to the CMO and they said, this is what we want. But I cannot stress enough how important that piece is. Listening to the market, getting to know the market, what the market wants, getting to understand what your ideal customer wants. Who exactly is that customer? And how can you get to know that person so well that you could almost be that person? And I think when I came out to launch the business in the US, to give you context, the Aussie market is obviously 25 or whatever, 23 million people, whatever we have back home, 24 million. The US market is just under 350 million people out here. So it just gives you context of how different and how enormous the US market is compared to our market back home. So back home, I have a business whereby we service any brand that wants to start a podcast. Obviously, a brand that has like a CMO, a C-suite that has like a full marketing team. So there is that, because of our pricing structure. But really, any brand that wants to start a podcast, so really corporations that want to start a podcast is who we work with in Australia. Any industry, any niche, it doesn't matter. We've done everything from Indeed.com's podcast, so that's, in the HR, job space. We've done it through to Alibaba Group, who did their podcast that's more in the tech space. Then we've done like Estia Health, which is a massive retirement company. We've done, last year we did the Queensland Tourism and Events, which is the Queensland government's, cast. We also did AGLs recently. So, in the energy space. So we have done across all industries, all spaces. As long as you want a podcast and you're a brand, we can serve you, or you're a corporate brand, we can serve you. Bringing that model out to the US market which is 50 times bigger than the Aussie market, did not work. And that was the rude awakening I had 12 months ago when I got here and thought, great, I've got a business in Australia. It works. The market fit is great. And then I come out here and everyone's like, so wait, who do you service? I'm like, oh, if you're a brand, we service you. It's like, wait, what? No, I'm sorry. We want a specialized brand agency that works directly with our kind of brand. And then I started to understand that the US market, for example, is so much more nuanced that in order to be able to even compete or even get anyone to take a meeting with you, you have to niche and you have to be able to go, you know what, we specifically work with brands in XYZ space. Naturally out here in the US and specifically in New York City, tech is massive, right? This is like tech epicenter. This New York and SF, San Francisco, like massive tech epicenters. And so naturally when we came out here, I thought, cool, niche in tech. I didn't understand at that time that to niche in tech is to niche in podcasts. Like, you know, it's just huge. Like even tech as a niche is not niche enough. And so as we waded through all the different segments of tech, from B2B SaaS to MarTech to Series A, Series B startup founders to, like, you know, all these different niches we tried, just like how I tried all these different companies when I first tried to start my business. I feel like in so many ways it's starting from scratch here. And so through all of that testing over the last 12 months, really what we've landed on is the VC niche. So the venture capital niche, which the reason we landed on this niche is because after testing about 5 or 6 different market segments within tech, we found out that through our research, we found out that VCs, venture capital firms, are the most engaged segment of tech in podcasting. So our research shows that after analyzing over 1,000 VCs, 1 in 10 VCs has a podcast. They're doing it themselves already. They're absolutely obsessed. And that stat is the reason why we decided to niche in versus other market segments. We couldn't even gather that data. There just wasn't enough action in podcasting. Again, we're in a niche space. We're in podcasting. We're not just a marketing agency. We're a podcast agency. So to be able to find that data was like so tough. And that means it's just not enough of it. And so being able to deep dive into the venture capital space, which again, in Australia is just honestly teensy tiny compared to what it is out here. It's huge. In New York City alone, there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of venture capital firms. Within the US, there's thousands upon thousands. Like, it's extraordinary. And so it's been so cool over the last couple of months to launch our sub-brand, which is called Podcasting for VCs by the Peers Project, where we specifically focus on servicing and working with venture capital firms and their associated portfolio co's. So their portfolio companies that they invest in to make their podcasts. And so that's just all to say that I think when you're starting any business, understanding the market that you're about to enter or you're looking to enter or you want to enter by doing as much research as you possibly can to be able to understand that if the need is even there, to be able to understand if there is any, you could potentially even find product to market fit. Like I would, if I'm being truly honest, we're still in that process of how do we find that product to market fit? There I go with perfect again. But how do I find product to market fit? So that means that, you know, the product you're offering aligns with the market wants it. The pricing structure aligns with what the market can afford to buy, and all of that comes together in like a beautiful kind of package. So it's been a journey I'm still on out here in the US, and something that I would 100% say to anyone looking to start a business.
Yeah, that's awesome. And let's say, to pretend I'm a VC right now listening to this podcast, and if I don't understand how podcasts could help my firm, what would you say?
Oh, yes. This is my pitch. I love pitching. So essentially, if you're a VC and you don't have a podcast, that's extraordinary to me already. The reason you need a podcast is because, for one, all of your competitors are out there podcasting. Everyone is out there podcasting. The VC landscape in the US alone, from 2008, it's crazy, I know these stats by heart, but 2008 to 22 has increased by 300%. That means there's been a 300% increase in the number of VC firms in the US in the last whatever that time frame is, over 12, 12, 15 years. That is extraordinary. In order to compete, you have to stand out. In order to compete, you have to have a brand. In order to have a brand, you need to think about, okay, well, how do I build that brand? And the best way to build your brand in 2024 and 2025 is through podcasting. Why? Because 500 million Americans listen to podcasts, because podcasting builds trust with audiences in the most, because it's an environment that allows for intimate connection that you cannot get from any other medium. Podcasting in the US is the number one most trusted medium. Podcasts increase brand awareness by 89%. So if you're a VC, you need to compete. You want to get your brand out there. You want to build a brand. You want to get your voice out there. Starting a podcast is the easiest way to do it. And in my head, it's like, if you don't have a podcast, what are you doing? Why not?
Yeah. Yeah, love that. Love that. I'll also put it in the show notes for people to get in contact as well.
Cool.
Now, I know we're running short on time, so I wanted to just do some quick fire questions. The first one is, what's the earliest dream you remember having that stayed with you to this day?
First thing that comes to mind is I wanted to be a doctor. That didn't end up happening or sticking with me, but I think if I break that down, I wanted to be someone that helped people, that was important, and that gave back. And I like to think that through the work I've done over the last, 7 years, and I hope to continue to do, through the podcasts we've created that amplify diverse voices and stories across all different niches, and now out here in the US with VC, I like to think that I've been able to make a bit of a mark, and that, what we've been able to create has impacted people positively. So I think in so many ways, it's reflected in what I hoped and dreamed for as a child.
Yeah, I love that. What's the weirdest job you've ever had?
Oh, goodness. Oh, I wouldn't say it's weird, but I was a sales assistant at a shoe store at one point in my early days when I was in university, one of the many. And I wouldn't say it was weird, but, I guess you could say it's weird, whereby essentially I'm helping people pick out their favorite shoes, and I'm making sure they feel amazing, and I'm like using all the sales skills I possibly can, when really they think I'm trying to be their best friend, but I don't really care about that. I just want to sell you the shoe and make the best sales list. So I would say it was probably the early days when I worked at Merchant.
Yeah. Okay. What's the most hurtful rejection you've ever overcome?
I don't want to throw them under the bus, but in a business context, there's been so many on the personal front, my goodness. On a business context, I will just say it. I was pitching years and years ago, so hopefully, they won't mind, but I was pitching Lululemon a podcast. And at the time, I just moved to Sydney, and this was before I came to New York, and Lululemon was like, oh my gosh, I have made it in life. I'm pitching Lululemon. Are you joking? This is insanity. And I became so attached to the deal, and the brand manager at the time and I we became so close. And it got to the point where they even signed. No, that's right. They were about to sign the contract. We'd been talking for months upon months. We already knew what the strategy was going to look like. We'd done so many decks, so much work to be able to pull this together. And then last minute, their headquarters in Canada pulled the plug. And so it wasn't even the Aussie team's fault, but it was the most shattering. I just remember I'd even told people, like my close friends, I was like, you'll never believe it. This is going to be the biggest deal yet. And it was just earth shattering. And I remember just thinking like, wow, we came so far. Like, and it just feels like it was just, the rug got pulled from underneath us, but as it happens.
Yeah. How did that experience, I guess, motivate you afterwards?
Oh my goodness. Every no is like, well, watch me sign another 5 deals. So I think in the best way possible. I think at the end of the day, experiences like that, they just make you stronger. They make you want more. They make you want to be better and achieve more. So I always try and take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, love that. If you had to live your life following the words of one single quote, what would it be?
Tomorrow is another day. My dad used to say this at the end of every day at the dinner table when we were at home when I was really young. And I can only imagine what kind of day he had, building his business and just like trying to hustle. And I just remember thinking he always he just has stuck with me all these years, where he would just sit down at the dinner table, we'd eat our meal, and then he'd be like, well, you know what, guys, at least, tomorrow's another day. And that for me holds so much weight, because as someone who always wants to, try my best and perform my best, knowing that if today's not your day, it's okay. Tomorrow's another day. You can do it tomorrow.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just as a final one, if you could reach everyone in the world for 30 seconds, what would you say to them?
Try, and try again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, before we finish up, how can people get in contact with you, with your podcast agency? Yeah, but both your main one and the one for VCs.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Firstly, Braith, thanks so much for this. I've absolutely loved it. Always love a good podcast, and you were a brilliant interviewer. So congrats on the show and everything that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Cool. So where can you guys find us? So you can follow me. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn. It's Michelle Akhidenor. My last name's horror to spell. So I'm sure Braith will put it in the show notes for you. But LinkedIn is the best place. I'm super active. I post every single day. I usually post about everything from entrepreneurship to my life in NYC to, starting a podcast specifically for VCs at this, because we're penetrating the US market. So follow along there. I'm also really active on Instagram from more a social front. So you can follow me there as well. All my links to all the businesses or, to the Peers Project through my LinkedIn. So it's really easy to find. But if you want to search us up, we're thepeersproject.com. It's PEERS project.com. You can follow us on Instagram. We're at the Peers Project. We have an awesome community there. We post all podcasting tips for anyone that wants to start a podcast. Definitely follow us there. And then you'll see the links to podcasting for VCs through that. But any VC that's listening, you can just head to podcastingforvcs.com.
Awesome. I'll put all of those in the show notes. And yeah, there were so many more tangents I wanted to go down. So maybe sometime in the future could do a part 2. But just thank you so much for your time today. It was super interesting to hear all this, especially now that I'm, doing the podcast myself and learning from all those awesome experiences you had.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, Braith. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much for the chat, and enjoy the election.
Thanks. Cheers.
All right. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, mate. Bye.